And joining us now is Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld, who's a senior associate in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on issues of rule of law, security and governance in post-conflict countries, fragile states and states in transition. She was the founding president of the Truman National Security Project and was appointed to the Foreign Affairs Policy Board, the advisory body to the United States Department of State. Her latest book is A Savage Order, How the World's Deadliest Countries Can Forge a Path to Security, and she has an article at Just Security, the GOP's Militia Problem, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and Lessons from Abroad. Welcome to Background Briefing, Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld.
So glad to be here, Ian. Thank you.
Well, thanks for joining us in today's hearings before the House Select Committee investigating January the 6th. I must say it ended on a rather intriguing note with the Vice Chair, Liz Cheney, saying that Donald Trump had approached one of the witnesses, I think it's a witness we haven't heard from, and I think it was a he, didn't take the call, but his lawyer took charge of the matter. And then she went on to warn, in effect, that witness tampering is a serious problem, which they take very seriously. That's pretty extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard now in two hearings that there's witness tampering that might be going on, and of course, that's not just a problem; it's a crime. And that crime before looked like it might have been being perpetrated by someone in Trump's entourage. This time, it's getting pretty clear from Cheney's comments that it might have been the former president himself. But I must add that getting President Trump on witness tampering is a little bit like getting Al Capone on tax evasion. I mean, what we're hearing in these hearings is extraordinary, from a president trying to overturn the results of a legitimate election to a president willing to coordinate with violent groups to overturn the results of an election when all other options failed him. And that coordination, while not absolutely explicitly connected to the president himself, other than his tweets, has been pretty explicitly connected to people who he was talking with just the days before, Roger Stone and General Mike Flynn. So this is really, as Jamie Raskin said, it makes Watergate look like a Cub Scout meeting.
So in terms of the work that you've done, though, Rachel, in studying post-conflict countries, fragile states, states in transition, states like Nigeria, Lebanon, Colombia, Iraq, countries where it's not uncommon for government officials to use violence as a political tool, did you ever think that you would be witnessing it here in this country?
No, I never did. I thought that my career was about failing democracies overseas, and I was trying to help other countries. It never occurred to me that I would be putting this expertise to use here. But that's my own blinders, honestly, and I think the blinders of a lot of us in America that think of ourselves as so exceptional. The history of using militias by political parties is very common in other democracies, and it's part of why their democracies don't work. Good people don't run for office when the option is not just losing, but being killed or having your family threatened. And that, from India to Iraq to places like Colombia, we've seen paramilitaries being used by political factions. And the first thing those factions try to erase, by the way, are the other parts of their own party that don't go along with violence. And that's what we're seeing here. We're seeing this violence not just directed against election officials, not just directed against women and African Americans and Jews and so on, although it is affecting all those groups, but also in very targeted manner being directed against other Republicans who draw the line at violence and support their country's system of government.
Well, we've had a lot of evidence that the intimidation part of it, at least not necessarily overt violence against political leaders, although the fact that then President of the United States, in effect, called upon the mob, not necessarily to hang Mike Pence, but that's what they decided in their chant. They built a gallows, and he even said, being questioned about that, Trump seemed to indicate that he didn't think that was a problem, that he didn't feel that there was anything wrong with essentially putting a target on Mike Pence's back. But the other Republican on the Select Committee, Adam Kinzinger, he's been routinely harassed. His family's been threatened. We know that Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State of Georgia, was threatened. His family had to move and seek protection. And Representative Gonzalez, who was one of 10 Republicans who voted to impeach Trump, his family's been threatened and his young children have been threatened. He decided not to run for re-election. The head of the Arizona House also was threatened along with his family, and a member of his family, his own daughter, was terminally ill at the time. That crowd showed up harassing him outside the door. So this is now in our body politic, right? The infection has already arrived, has it not?
That's right. And the reason I fault myself for not thinking that it would happen here is that it's happened here in the past. We had the Know Nothing Party in the 1850s that used violence and intimidation. We had in the 19-teens and 20s scores of political officials from both sides who were members of the Ku Klux Klan. And we knew in the late 50s and 60s, after Brown versus Board of Education was decided, that massive resistance, which was violent intimidation by the Ku Klux Klan and other groups, was endorsed by a whole series of Southern politicians. Those were Southern Democrats, of course. So this is not new to America. And it is back, and it is back in force, and it is not just Donald Trump. I think one of the things that Americans need to start wrapping their heads around is just how much militias are being used by local chapters of the Republican Party to get rid of more traditional members of the Republican Party. I think Republicans in general, I come from a Republican family, I should say. My parents are both Republican. One of my brothers is. They aren't aware of just how much their party has changed in the last 10 or 15 years. The turnover in Congress, the turnover at the state level, and that you're really dealing with a very radicalized group of people now who are not the party of Reagan. You might have disagreed with the party of Reagan's policies, or you might have agreed, but what we're dealing with now is a faction of the Republican Party that's taking over that is not a pro-democratic party.
And this faction is clearly led by Donald Trump. He is the de facto leader of the Republican Party, is he not? And he's pretty much unchallenged. And there's even suggestions that he may even announce that he's running for president in 2024.
I can't really understand why he hasn't announced already, because it would be much harder to remove the candidate of a major political party in a lawsuit. We've seen that in Brazil. They did that, for instance, and it goes down poorly, and that makes democracy function poorly, even if the accountability is merited. So for whatever reason, he has not managed to do that yet, and that's probably just as well. But I think it'd be good to move these indictments quickly before he does announce, because it's easier to indict a private citizen than the leader of one of our two parties. One of the problems is that we only have two parties. If we had ranked choice voting or more open primary system connected with that, what we could have is multiple Republicans running against each other, multiple Democrats. You could have your progressive Democrats and your center left and your Trump-y Republicans and your business conservatives. And Americans would both have more choice, but they could also vote for pro-democracy leaders who supported their policies and ideology. That sounds real wonky. Ranked choice voting does not sound like the answer to what we just heard on the January 6th Select Committee testimony, but in fact, it is one of the answers.
And again, I'm speaking with Rachel Kleinfeld, who's a senior associate in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on issues of rule of law, security and governance in post-conflict countries, fragile states, and states in transition. Her latest book is A Savage Order, How the World's Deadliest Countries Can Forge a Path to Security. And she has an article at Just Security, The GOP's Militia Problem, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and Lessons from Abroad. Well, I'm astounded, though, that and obviously the full weight of the evidence and the way it will be collated and presented hasn't happened yet, since there's more hearings next week. But they're getting towards the end of it. But so far, they've built such a strong and, I think, glaring case that there was really what amounts to a fascist coup attempt on January the 6th, and it's not gone away. And I'm just somewhat astounded that that's not kind of a unifying message out there. I understand a lot of people on the political left are disappointed with Biden, and there may be a lot of passivity in terms of getting out the vote. But surely people could and should be united around what the real threats to America are. which are pretty glaring, that we could very shortly become a one-party state, and we would have a country led by this frail and criminal president. We'd have people like Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene and company as the face of the cabinet. I mean, it's an appalling thought, but it's not. This is not science fiction. This is staring us in the face, isn't it?
I think that's exactly right, and I think it's crucial to rally the right and the left who care about our country. I think one of the issues that's getting in the way is that it's been hard for democracy to deliver to parts of the left that are the base, and so they shrug their shoulders and say, "Well, democracy is not delivering. Why should I come out and vote?" And there's a point there, but the fact is, it can get a lot worse. I work in a lot of countries where political violence is routine, where a violent government targets individuals and targets groups of individuals for their race, religion, ethnicity. We as a country think that we might be bad now, and some parts of our country think that America's already doing that. You haven't seen anything compared to what a government can do if it wants to really take the gloves off. And I think a second Trump term would be taking the gloves off. There's no doubt, because this isn't just Trump, because it's infected so much of the Republican parties up and down. And so I think we somehow have to get folks to vote and to understand that it's just essential. But then we need to deliver. We really need to start delivering policies that help ordinary people. It's no surprise that Trump won when you had over 70% of the American public saying that they thought the whole system was rigged prior to 2016. You just can't run a democracy when people feel that it's run for the elite's benefit.
Well, but we don't have a democratic tradition in this country, do we, in the form of social democracy, where you vote for politicians who are stewards of your tax money and deliver government services based upon your tax money. I mean, we have politics that involve extraneous issues which are passionately felt, like guns and abortion, etc. So how do you focus people on the notion that there's a simple transaction with government? You pay your taxes and you get your services, and we should judge them, our politicians, on what kind of stewards they are of our tax money, as opposed to essentially having a government of telemarketers who spend all their days dialing for dollars.
Yeah, I think this is a conversation that the left has to have within itself, and the right that is still pro-democratic has to have within itself, because what we see after populist authoritarian leaders like Trump is a democratic degradation that happens. And one of the parts of that degradation is that what you get is these polarized extremes that start running. So in Colombia, we just saw an election between a former guerrilla fighter and a real right-wing sort of authoritarian type who'd been a corrupt mayor prior to that. We saw a similar polarized breakdown in Peru. We've seen it in Italy, where in Italy it got so bad that the left-wing party, the Five Star Party, actually teamed up with the right-wing party, which was a nativist, anti-immigrant party, and they ruled together because the edges meet eventually. But this is what you see after this kind of populist authoritarian, because both sides say, I want nothing to do with the other side. I cannot make common cause. There's no center that holds. I'm going to go fully on the extreme. And that scares the dickens out of the other side, and they do the same thing. And then what you get is this wildly careening country where nothing gets done. It's not that the far left policies get done, and it's not that the far right get done. Each gets done for a couple of years, and then they get overturned, and they just go back and forth. And what suffers is any kind of normality, stability, ability to plan your life in the interim.
And your work has made clear, surely, Rachel, that politicians are using gangs for political purposes is not exclusive to the right or the left. You've got Maduro in Venezuela using street gangs to intimidate the opposition, and likewise Ortega in Nicaragua doing the same thing. And that's exactly what the hearings today were about, were they not? The extent to which Donald Trump used a street gang organization known as the Proud Boys. The other organization, the Oath Keepers, tend to be ex-military, but they are, as the witness who was the former PR person for the Oath Keepers said, they're a violent militia.
Yeah, so as you said, we've seen this before in a lot of countries, and it really doesn't matter about the ideology. Ortega in Nicaragua, Maduro and Chavez before him in Venezuela. We see it in Nigeria. We see it in Colombia and Iraq, India. India now has 10 sitting leaders in their assembly who've been convicted of murder. That's where this leads. India used to be the world's largest democracy. Freedom House, where I sit on the board, has just downgraded it to partially democratic. When politicians start using these kinds of violent groups, they don't need to commit violence. They can just intimidate. And if the intimidation is credible enough, which it already is, that does the job. So it, as you said, is scaring Republicans from running for office. It's probably scaring a lot of Democrats from running for office. It's affecting not just national leaders, it's affecting people running for school board. We've had an awful lot of threats and violence directed at, moms running for school board. And one part of this that you mentioned before, but I just want to highlight, is that quite often when these people are parents, the threats are against their children. And what it does to a democracy when no candidate can be a young parent because they're afraid for their children, that's an entire constituency that's wiped out of both the left and the right. That's the kind of thing we're starting to see in our country.
Well, a few days ago, I spoke with Jeff Charlotte, who embedded himself with a lot of these militias around the country in Wisconsin and also in some of these Christian nationalist churches here in the state of California, and went to demonstrations in Sacramento with sort of neo-Nazis, etc., and spent some time investigating the woman that was shot in the assault on the Capitol. And she apparently was married to a Marine and was relatively normal, but absolutely fell for Trump, hook, line, and sinker, and then eventually died and is considered a martyr by these people. But the one thread that kept coming through all the conversation with these people that he was spending time with was that they not only expect a civil war, they welcome it. They believe it's inevitable. So I don't know how much more violent it's going to get towards November, but as long as Trump's around, he's made it clear. That was the first half of the hearing, was it not, today, Rachel, where they basically walked you through the fact that all of the sort of adults around Trump, a lot of whom were lawyers, were standing up for the rule of law, and then Trump just found another group of people that were ill-informed and essentially lawless, and he went with the latter instead of the former. That was the lesson of the day.
I think there were a number of lessons today that got pulled out. And I think you're absolutely right about Trump being willing to go with whomever will tell him what he wants to hear, and ignore all the adults in the room. I think that's it's indicative of a personality where he really thinks that being a president is being a king, the way that my 4-year-old thinks of a king. Where your power is unlimited and there is no rule of law that constrains you and there are no institutions and rules. I think that's very much how Trump conceived of the presidency. And so anyone who told him, actually, we're a democracy, we have laws and we have institutions, you have power, but it's not unlimited, in fact, it's fairly limited, did not meet with his fancy. So, that's been proven about the character of this man who's a former president, maybe a future one. Another thing that got pulled out that I just want to highlight because we haven't talked about it is that one of the things that happened on January 6th was that we saw non-aligned militia groups and violent groups and white supremacist groups and so on start aligning. Those of us who study political violence know that that is incredibly dangerous because these groups tend to be rivals. They're fighting for membership, and they tend to try to do more and more spectacular things that are horrible to the rest of us to get members to join them. But they tend to be competitive with one another. And when they start aligning, violence can just skyrocket because they can work together as opposed to working against one another. And we started seeing that in the lead up to the January 6th rally, but we've continued to see that. So the groups that monitor political violence have continued to see Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, different groups that had different ideologies. Some were white nationalists, some were Western chauvinists, some were militia and anti-government, but very much included different racial groups. Now we're seeing them all come together, and we're seeing them use mainstream conservative causes, anti-CRT rallies, anti-mask rallies, all sorts of things like that, to recruit new followers. So what we're starting to see are that these regular conservative causes are becoming gateways into a real extremist movement. And then the extremist movement is blended in ideology so that it's kind of like extremism light. You don't have to be that crazy to start walking down it. There's a lot of jokes, there's a lot of memes. And by the time you realize you're fully engaged, you've lost a lot of your personality and yourself, just like we heard today from the rioter who lost his house and so on, or lost his job in the following his conviction.
So just in closing then, I recently spoke with Gloria Steinem about the Supreme Court's abortion ruling, and she made the statement that if you don't vote, you don't exist. What can be done to galvanize around the findings of this committee? And we were speaking earlier about the fact that we don't really have the luxury of whining about the shortcomings of the Biden administration because there's such a looming threat out there. So that's my sense, is that we are at an incredibly critical moment. Perhaps nothing is as critical as the 1850s, just prior to the Civil War. And we mentioned the fact that those out there on the far right actually are preparing for a civil war. What's your sense of the best scenario here in terms of political pushback at this critical moment so that we don't lose our democracy?
The absolute best thing would be for the Republicans to clean house internally, because only by doing that and taking back their party do we have a normal politics where the left and right can just fight about policies. You know, I'm of the left. I have strong views about abortion and immigration and all sorts of things and working wages. But right now we cannot have those policy discussions because if we lose our democracy, we will not have the chance to have those policy discussions. And we've lost democracy before. I think it's hard for Americans to think about that. It's not the kind of progressive view of history we've always been taught. But we had, depending on how you count it, 10 to 12 states, Jim Crow laws that basically installed a one-party state throughout much of the South. You could not vote that party out. You could have different flavors of that party, but you couldn't get rid of them, not until the Voting Rights Act passed. And that was because of the disenfranchisement of African Americans, but also a lot of working class whites, and also just a system in which that one-party rule was entrenched. And because of that one-party rule, other things happened nationally because they controlled so many states that affected our national politics. In that case, it was the Democratic Southern Party. Now it is a Republican Party. And we are again in a situation in which we could enshrine one-party rule at the national level or at the state level for a very long time. And if it's at the state level, it'll be in the senatorial level, because that's how our elections work. And so we really do need to realize there's an inflection point. Jim Crow lasted, depending on the state, 75 years. We do not want to go back to that kind of a system. And we are the generation that's going to decide that.
Well, Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Dr. Rachel Kleinfeld, who's a Senior Associate in the Democracy, Conflict and Governance Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where she focuses on issues of rule of law, security, and governance in post-conflict countries, fragile states, and states in transition. She was the founding president of the Truman National Security Project and was appointed to the Foreign Affairs Policy Board, the advisory body to the United States Department of State. And her latest book is A Savage Order, How the World's Deadliest Countries Can Forge a Path to Security. And she has an article at Just Security, the GOP's Militia Problem, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, and Lessons from Abroad. We're going to take a brief station break and back looking into the Israeli press reports that Biden's visit to Israel on Wednesday through Friday will be crowned by the Jerusalem Declaration, a U.S.-Israel strategic partnership